Treaty 3. Blackfoot knowledge keeper and scholar Leroy Littlebear says that we must move beyond the either-or mentality of Western thought. He says, quote, "We're not talking about either Western science or native science. What we're talking about is a marriage of the two, because that'll bring about enrichment," end quote. Science has flourished thanks to the previous work done by Indigenous communities through their intimate knowledge of the land, contributing significantly to medicines and healing practices relied on throughout the world. The Creator instructed medicine herbs of the world to take away sickness and bring healing. We are grateful for knowledge keepers who remember how to use these plants. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to the medicines and to the keepers of medicines. Now our minds are one. As we continue the advances in science, may our ideas grow and be influenced by the traditional teachings of the Earth Mother so that we can practice different and healthier ways of interacting with one another, both human and non-human.
And with that gratitude, we welcome you to our first scientist in residence post-pandemic. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. My name is Tim Rogalski. I'm professor of mathematics here at CMU.
And my name is Katrina Linksavath. I'm a third-year Arts and Sciences student here at CMU, and I'm one of the student representatives on the Science and Faith Initiatives Committee.
And we're so pleased to welcome Dr. Frances Su to be among us today and tomorrow. We had a wonderful forum this morning on racial discrimination in this case, in the Mathematical Association of America and the American Mathematical Society. And there were some fantastic learnings for us all on opportunities for all of us to be more inclusive. Dr. Su is an award-winning author of a book that has just sold out in our bookstore. More about that a little bit later. An award-winning teacher, former president of the Mathematical Association of America. We're just so pleased to have him here.
The topic tonight is mathematics for human flourishing. Whether you consider yourself a math person or not, mathematics permeates every aspect of our society and plays a significant role in shaping a variety of disciplines. We hope there will be something for everyone to take away from tonight.
I read the book when it first came out, and I was so excited. I was searching for an opportunity. Would I assign it for a class? There was this one, there was that one, and then the opportunity came to invite you, and this is even better because we can now share this with everybody. It's just a wonderful vision of how math is inclusive, how it's beautiful, how it inspires awe and wonder and creativity, and so many of the beautiful things that just make us human. I'm very excited. So we will have a talk from Dr. Su. There will be a response from psychology professor Dalmar Epp. There will be some questions and responses. Audience is welcome to participate in questions. We'll close everything at about 8:30, and there will be a book signing table here if you brought a book, if you're lucky enough to have purchased one. And if you're not, we can take your name on a list because there are more on back order. And there are stickers here that Dr. Su will sign for you to insert into your book at a later time. Please, Dr. Su.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Spent the day getting to meet many of you and speaking in some of your classes, and I admire all the work that you are doing here to think broadly about what your education is for. And I want us to think tonight a little bit more along those lines. And in particular, if you see a math in the title and that scares you off, this is really more a talk about what it means to be a human being. Here's a tiny human being. It's my son. His name is Nate, and my wife, Natalie. Nate is 2.5 years old, and it's a very delightful age because he's just starting to talk and think and for himself, and his will is very different from ours sometimes, and that's fun, and it's also part of what makes raising him exciting. But something else that I'm realizing is that he's also starting to be mathematical. Of course, you might be thinking, what are you talking about? He's 2.5 years old. No, he doesn't count yet. I mean, well, he does count a little bit, but it's not. That's the last thing that I'm thinking about when I see that he's thinking mathematically. What I'm talking about is the following thing that occurred only recently. A few weeks ago, my wife and I, since we got married, have not even bothered to unpack our TV, okay? And so just recently, we were having some people over the house for the first time in years, and we thought, okay, we should unpack the TV, right? So we put it out in the living room, and the little guy was just mesmerized, right? He'd never seen anything so marvelous, right? And the next day, completely out of the blue, he says to us, "Shall we turn on Big Phone?" We were like, "What are you talking?" Oh, right? His experience of little phone, and of course the big phone that's now in our living room. And it occurred to me that that is one of Nate's first expressions of mathematical thinking, because he's seeing a pattern. This thing looks like this thing. This big phone looks like little phone, right? He's learning to abstract, right? And the abstraction has a purpose, right? It's to try to understand the world and place things in categories, and this is like this. It's part of the human condition to be mathematical. I want to convince you of that tonight and what implications that has for us. Take a look at this picture. This is a piece of art by George Frederick Watts in 1886, a turbulent time, as I'll explain in a minute. Take a moment and look at this painting as a work of art. What do you notice about it? And what do you wonder? Now that I've given you a moment to think about it, discuss with your neighbor. What do you notice and what do you wonder about this painting? All right, what do you notice about the painting and what do you wonder? Just go ahead and call out some things that you notice or wonder about it.
She's blindfolded.
She's blindfolded. Why is she blindfolded? What else? What is she sitting on top of? It looks like a globe. What happens when you look at art? You're like looking at the pieces of the painting, the elements. You're trying to understand what the relationship is to one another. You see this figure sitting atop a globe. Looks like she's in despair, and yet this painting is entitled Hope. Why is it entitled Hope? And she's plucking what looks like a lyre with a single unbroken string in it. She strains to hear its music. And maybe only after some time do you notice a single lone star just over her left shoulder out of her view. And you wonder, why is she blindfolded? Why is she in despair? What does the star represent? And why is the painting entitled Hope? So then, of course, you seek to find out more context, don't you? You learned that in the 1880s, the world was emerging from a recession known as the Long Depression. This was the biggest before the Great Depression. You might see then that the painting captures a certain pessimism of the times. You might learn that in 1959, Martin Luther King wrote a sermon entitled Shattered Dreams, in which he asked this question based on this painting: who has not had to face the agony of blasted hopes and shattered dreams? And yet this harpist, in strumming this very last string, has the audacity of hope, inspiring the title of a memoir by a young senator from Illinois named Obama. It's based on this painting, The Audacity of Hope. Now, why do I open with this piece of art? What does it have to do with mathematics? Well, it's because when we see art, we seek to engage it, because all of us have basic human desires, don't we? It's beautiful, and we desire beauty. It's relevant to our current moment, and we desire meaning. It's captivating, and we desire to explore it. It causes us to wonder, to ask questions, to seek its truth, and to be willing to be patient for a single lone star to show itself. So why don't we approach mathematics the way we approach art? Every being cries out silently to be read differently. 10 years ago now, I received a letter out of the blue by an incarcerated man, an inmate in a federal prison. His name is Christopher. He's been in prison since he was a teenager. He was involved in drugs. He never finished high school. And he was involved in a series of armed robberies at age 19, and he landed in prison with a 32-year sentence. When you think about who does mathematics, would you think of Christopher? And yet he wrote me this letter after 7 years in prison. He said this: "I've always had a proclivity for mathematics, but being in a very early stage of youth and living in some adverse circumstances, I never came to understand the true meaning and benefit of pursuing an education." You see, Chris had studied his way through a series of textbooks, and he was now writing me for help in furthering his mathematics education. So, I ask again, when you think about who does mathematics, would you think of Christopher? And yet, he has inspired me, a professional mathematician, to believe even more fully that math has something to offer everyone. Every being cries out silently to be read differently. That quote was on my title slide, and it's a quote by Simone Weil, who is a French religious mystic, a philosopher. If you are familiar with some of her writings, she writes often about many issues, I think, of concern to this community. She's probably less well known as the younger sister of André Weil, one of history's most famous number theorists, mathematicians. And for Simone Weil, to read someone means to interpret or make a judgment about them. She's saying every being cries out silently to be judged differently. And of course, I sometimes wonder if she were crying out about herself, because she too loved and participated in mathematics, but she was always comparing herself to her older brother. She writes this. She said, "At 14, I fell into one of those fits of bottomless despair that come with adolescence, and I seriously thought of dying because of the mediocrity of my natural faculties. The exceptional gifts of my brother, who had a childhood and youth comparable to those of Pascal, brought my own inferiority home to me. I didn't mind having no visible successes, but what did grieve me was the idea of being excluded from that transcendent kingdom to which only the truly great have access and wherein truth abides. And I preferred to die rather than live without that truth." You see, she was in such angst over comparing herself to her older brother. And now we know Simone actually loved mathematics, because you'll find her in many mathematical examples throughout her philosophical writing. And you'll find her in photos like this of Bourbaki. This is a group of influential French mathematicians that included her brother. This is at the left, you'll see her poring over some notes. She's sitting at left, and that's her brother, Andre, waving the bell. And it's hard not to look at this picture and ask, what was it like to be Simone, the single lone woman among a bunch of men? What would her relationship to mathematics have been like if she weren't always in Andre's shadow? Every being cries out silently to be read differently. Now, of course, you might look at me, a professional mathematician, and think that my relationship to math has always been solid. Maybe you think I've never struggled in math. But I grew up in a small rural town in South Texas. Yeah, by the way, that is me with hair. A small rural town in South Texas with limited opportunities. Most of my high school peers didn't go to college. And of course, I was fortunate because I had supportive teachers. I had parents who encouraged me in education, and I managed to get admitted to Harvard for my PhD. But when I got there, I suddenly fell out of place because unlike most of my peers, I didn't come from an Ivy League school. I didn't have a whole slate of graduate courses under my belt when I got there, unlike many of my peers. And so I felt like Simone Weil, standing next to future Andre Weiss, thinking I would never be able to flourish if I were not like them. And I even had one professor, a famous professor, tell me I didn't have what it takes to be a successful mathematician. And of course, I can look at that comment now and think, okay, well, whatever, right? But at the time, that comment really hurt, right? It cut to the core of my identity, and suddenly I was forced to ask basic questions, like, why am I even doing math, right? Is the whole purpose of math to just get a PhD so that I can be seen as somehow recognized as smart? So that's a question I want all of us to think through tonight. Why is it that we do mathematics or learn mathematics at all? Why do any of us learn mathematics? Why is Christopher sitting in a prison cell studying calculus that he'll most likely never use? Why was Simone so captivated by transcendent mathematical truths? Why should anybody persist in doing mathematics when others are telling her in subtle and maybe not so subtle ways that she doesn't belong? Society also is asking what its relationship to mathematics should be like. Is mathematics only a tool to make you, quote, college and career ready so you can go and achieve your real aims in life? Or is math only for the elite few? And of course, the perennial question, why study math if you'll never use what you're learning, right? When will I ever use this? That's a big question that we often ask, don't we? And these questions often arise because math is only ever seen as a means to an end, a tool you're going to use later, rather than a pursuit that serves you well right now. And so when kids ask, when will I ever use this, what they're really asking is, when am I ever going to value this, right? And we begin to equate value with utility unless we can see that you can value something more. And yet in a Florida prison, Christopher has never asked, when will I ever use this? Has he? He's poring over textbooks, learning math in hopeful anticipation of its own intrinsic rewards. So if you ask me, why do mathematics, I would say this. One more point I want to make. So one of the reasons that it's important for us to ask this question and think about this question is that in some sense, we are all math teachers, right? All of you, all of us are parents potentially someday, uncles, aunts, coaches. And our relationship to mathematics strongly affects other people's relationships to mathematics, right? Studies show that in fact, if you are a parent with math anxiety, you're more likely to have kids with math anxiety, right? We pass on attitudes about mathematics when we talk about math in a certain way, saying, oh, I'm not a math person, or son, you just don't have the math gene, whatever that means, right? So our relationship to mathematics matters. We create societal norms around who does mathematics. So if you ask me, why do mathematics, I would say this. It's not simply because you'll get a good job if you have a math career. It shouldn't be about achievement, getting a math PhD so that you can be seen as elite. What it really should be about is mathematics helping people flourish. Mathematics is for human flourishing. Now, when I say human flourishing, what I'm referring to is a certain wholeness, both of being and of doing. So there's a character aspect and there's an action that results that comes about as a result of a changed character. I'm talking about helping people, realizing your own potential and helping other people do the same, of acting with honor and treating others with dignity, of living with integrity, even in challenging circumstances. So it's not just the same as happiness. Human flourishing isn't just a state of mind. One way to think about human flourishing is the well-lived life. What does it mean to live life well, even in challenging circumstances? The ancient Greeks had a word for this. They used the word eudaimonia. They sort of saw this as the overarching good in life. There's also a word in Hebrew, shalom, which is often used as a greeting. A similar word in Arabic, salam, right? These words mean peace. But to say shalom to someone is not just, it almost can't be captured by just saying peace. It's almost like you're saying a blessing to someone. Shalom means to wish that people would flourish and live well. And a basic question taken up by philosophers or maybe college students here at Canadian Mennonite University is, what does it mean to live life well? How do you achieve human flourishing? Now, one potential answer to that question comes from Aristotle, who says that flourishing comes about through the exercise of virtue. So I like to think of virtue as a certain excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. So it includes more than just moral virtues. I know often when you hear virtue, you think about morality. You think about honesty, ethics, right? Goodness, decency. But let me enlarge that perspective a little bit to include more things like courage, persistence in problem solving, right? Being able to solve problems you've never seen before. These are virtues. And just to maybe put a point on this, one of my students went off who was a senior, went off to interview for a job, a high-powered job on Wall Street. She came back from the interview and she said, you know, I got the most interesting question on my interview. I said, oh, yeah, what was it? She said, they asked me, how many times is a toilet flushed in New York City during a commercial break of the Super Bowl? Why would they ask her that question? How would you answer that question? Why would they ask her that question? Any ideas? Do you think they really cared how many times a toilet is flushed? No, probably not. Why? Why would they ask her that question? It's because they want to what? They want to see how she thinks, right? And there's many ways you could approach this problem, couldn't you, right? You could start with the number of people in New York City. Oh, maybe that's about 20 million, right? Or you might start differently. You might start with how many times does a person need to go to the bathroom over 3 hours, right? And then do they save it all up for the commercial break, right? Lots of ways to approach the problem, lots of potential sources of data that you might need to find if you don't have it at your fingertips. They're looking to see if she has virtues like being able to think, being able to reason, being able to be resourceful, call on sources of data that she doesn't have yet in order to answer some of these questions. Of course, nobody expects you to know how many people are actually in New York City at any given moment. You could look that up, right? But they need people who can think and be resourceful. So they said to her, talk me through your reasoning. They wanted to hear how she thinks. This is what I mean by virtue. So I like to distinguish virtues from skills. Okay, skills are specific things that you learn, like recalling certain facts or algorithms. And yes, don't get me wrong, it is important to know your times tables, right? There's a reason we learned that, so that you can do some basic things without having to think. You can be automatic about certain things. Factoring, taking a derivative, right? These are all specific skills. Yes, they might be important, but often when you learn these things, if you don't end up having a career where you need to know these things, you often ask, why do I need to know this stuff, right? On the other hand, virtues are character qualities, persistence, creativity, the ability to tackle problems you've never seen before. These are virtues. And if you want to get practical about it, and I don't want to get completely practical, skills are replaceable. Virtues are not. Think about all the things we can automate now with the help of calculators, computers, and even artificial intelligence, right? If you have a job that's based on skills, guess what? It's probably going away. Virtues, on the other hand, are always going to be in demand. It's really what employers are looking for, honestly. It's when they hire a math major or somebody who's got mathematical thinking. And not only that, virtues make your life richer. It's part of what it means to flourish, to live life well, to see the world in a different way, to be able to look at something you see every day and say, yeah, I understand how that works, or I'm interested in learning how that works. These are virtues. To put it another way, think a little bit about some of the challenges that people today need to solve. None of us were trained for some of these problems. We didn't go to college learning skills for these particular problems, right? Basically, the invention of the smartphone or any of the new technological gizmos, people 20 years ago in college didn't learn specific skills for those things, but they learned how to think and to reason and to innovate and be creative and to see things out of the box in a new way. That's what enables you to innovate. And so doing mathematics, I claim, cultivates virtues, and virtues help people flourish. And the movement towards virtues happens because we're all human beings. We have basic human desires, basic wants and needs. Right? Think about a hobby that you have and what draws you to that hobby, right? Several people at dinner tonight talked about some of their hobbies, right? I love solving puzzles, one person said, right? Why? Well, because it meets a basic human desire, right? Some basic human desire, otherwise you wouldn't do it, right? It's that feeling I get when I actually solve a problem, right? It's the thrill, it's the joy that comes about. That's a certain kind of basic human desire. Somebody said they enjoy running, right? Why do you enjoy running? Well, often it's because, there's lots of potential answers. I want to feel one with nature, right? So that's an experience of oneness with nature or beauty, right? That's a spiritual, in some sense, spiritual desire. What are the basic human desires that every human being has? I claim many of them mathematics can meet. So here's a basic human desire for beauty. So think a little bit about art. So I asked you to look at a piece of art, and what happens when you look at art? You stop and you reflect, just like this figure is doing in front of this mathematical design. It looks like stained glass. One of my friends actually did illustrations for the book, and this is one of the beautiful illustrations. Right? You see a striking pattern governed by mathematical laws, and it causes you to stop, to reflect, to ask why. You see patterns in nature that cause you to stop and say, whoa, what created those patterns in sand? Why does it look like that? Or this fractal cauliflower, right? Whoa, how did nature do that? Turbulence under an airplane wing. And this question, why, drives us from a certain sensory beauty, which is beauty of physical objects. It's probably one of the first places you begin to behold beauty, to a certain wondrous beauty, which is a beauty of ideas. Right, like the idea in calculus that you encounter for the first time that it actually makes sense to add up a bunch of things, infinitely many things, right? There's some idea wrapped up there that somehow so I like to talk about calculus as the act of cutting things up in pieces and putting them back together again, right? And being able to get answers to things, to questions that are worth solving. And that often brings you to a unique form of beauty in mathematics, which I like to call insightful beauty. This is the beauty of reasoning, the fact that demonstrations of truths themselves can be awe-inspiring. That's almost unique to mathematics, like the idea that demonstrations themselves can be interesting. Like this figure. If you take a square and you cut it into 4 pieces and color 3 of those pieces, each of those corners has area 1/4, doesn't it? Yes? If you take that last uncolored piece and you cut it into 4 smaller pieces, then each of those little sub-squares has area 1/4 times 1/4, right? 1/16. Color 3 of them, take the last corner, cut it. Color 3, take the last corner, cut it. Keep going. What do you see when you do that? On the right picture, you see that the red, green, and blue pieces all have the same area, don't they? Yes? And they add up to the total area of the square. So they must add up to 1/3. The powers of 1/4 add up to a third. And in one fell swoop, you see why that particular fact above is true from a picture. Whoa, mind blown, right? And when you see something like that, you ask, oh gosh, what other things can I understand that way, right? You immediately think in a creative way, which is, I have a hammer now, what else can I use to do with it? And of course, that maybe the deepest form of beauty in mathematics is this transcendent beauty, the beauty of seeing the big picture, right? The fact that sometimes you see patterns here and there, and you begin to generalize, just like my little kid, right? This is a phone, this is a phone. Whoa, his mind was blown, right? Or our minds were blown, right? Now, actually, we don't even call the TV in our house. We call it big phone, because we're so enamored by his description. Right? Transcendent beauty. Here's a way different people have talked about this experience of beauty. C.S. Lewis called it the echo of a tune we have not yet heard. Right? News from a country we've never visited. That's the experience of transcendent beauty. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner talked about the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics to the formulation of laws of physics is a gift which we neither understand nor deserve, right? That's the experience of transcendent beauty. It feels sublime, almost divine, right? Transcendent beauty provokes in us a feeling that there's something out there just waiting to be grasped, right? That may be of ultimate meaning. And so when you see the same beautiful idea pop up everywhere, you begin to think it's pointing to some truth you have not yet grasped. When you realize you've had exactly the same mathematical thoughts as another person separated from you by oceans, by culture, by time, you begin to think there might be some universal enduring reality that you're somehow both accessing. Whoa, mind blown. It's for this reason that the famed mathematician Paul Erdős often spoke of, quote, the book that God keeps, in which all the most beautiful proofs are recorded. And actually, Paul Erdős wasn't a religious person. In fact, he often talked about God as the supreme fascist, so he was not necessarily a friend of religion. But he's known to have quipped, you don't have to believe in God, but you should believe in the book, right? In this book that the most beautiful proofs are recorded. Pursuing mathematics for its beauty actually builds in us virtues, like the virtue of reflection, when you contemplate beautiful ideas just like you contemplate beautiful forests. Something went out here. It leads to a certain joyful gratitude and transcendent awe. We're back? Oh, perfect. Awesome. And when you experience beauty from seeing an idea everywhere, it builds in us habits of generalization, right? That's what my little kid was doing. It's the same thing that happens when I'm cooking a stir fry, right? Like, I'm the kind of person who, I want to go into the kitchen, I don't really want to be memorizing recipes, right? I want to be able to just go in and whip up anything I want. And how do you do that? You do that by looking at lots of recipes and looking for general principles. Like, for instance, Chinese stir fries always start with adding chopped garlic and onions first, right? It always ends with the leafy vegetables, putting them in last, otherwise they're going to lose their color, right? And so once you see the principles, you don't need to memorize the recipes, you just know the principles. And those principles are what allow you to innovate, to be creative. This is a virtue you get by reflecting on beauty. So what can we do? Well, we can look for beauty everywhere, right? You can do that even in your math courses or your science courses or places you don't necessarily think of as places to encounter beauty. Appreciating patterns in art, music, and rhythm. Digging deep to understand ideas, right? Reasoning and applications. I have a website in case you want to see some things that I think are beautiful called Math Fun Facts, which you might enjoy reading. Here's another basic human desire, the desire to explore, desire for exploration. One of my hobbies as a kid was astronomy. I enjoyed looking up at the stars, and I lived in a rural area like this where you could actually see stars. In Los Angeles, you can't see stars at all, right? People live their whole lives in LA, and they get out of the city, and they're like, whoa, there are stars, right? And I grew up in the 70s when we were just sending our very first probes into space. And I saw pictures like this for the first time in the newspaper, which are the rings of Saturn. They're like, basically, Saturn has rings because they're a bunch of icy rocks that orbit around the planet. And they go at different speeds. And one of the interesting things about the rings of Saturn is that people ask, why are there patterns in the rings? And it turns out the answer is mathematical, believe it or not. So I'll just give you a little glimpse of that. There's a moon called Mimas, and it turns out that the moons of Saturn actually exert certain forces, tidal forces on the rocks in the following way. Just like, when if you orbit on the inner lanes, it's like runners along lanes. Along the inner lanes, you go faster because you're closer to the planet. On the outer lanes, you go slower. Are everyone with me? Okay.
Along the inner light in your Apple Music.
Sorry, I don't know why my watch is talking to me. But what's interesting is, so if you are at a lane which happens to be in resonance with a moon's orbit. So every time the moon goes around once, you go around twice on an inner lane. Then that's a situation where at the exact same point in the orbits, every 2 orbits, you are being tugged at, pulled by this moon in the same direction. It's exactly the same thing that happens when you push a kid on a swing. If you push them at the end of the swing every time, they go higher. And that effect actually pushes rocks out of particular orbits. So this big gap is actually caused by a 2-to-1 ratio, a resonance with the orbit of the moon Mimas. And so basically, if you end up in that lane, you get pushed out because of the tug of this moon. Many of the other rings, gaps can be explained that way. Okay, but I digress. This is a deep human desire for us to explore and to understand, right? And actually, math exploration is very similar to space exploration, but it's a different kind of space. It's a space of ideas. You're captivated by mystery. You're motivated by questions. And you're unfazed when you hit a setback. This is what mathematical exploration is like. And it's at the heart of what it means to do mathematics, right? And you don't need a lot of resources except your mind to be a math explorer. So you can embark on an adventure from anywhere, a prison, a small rural town, or some far-flung corner of the earth. And it builds in us certain virtues to approach mathematics in this way. What virtues does it build? Well, it builds in us virtues like imagination and creativity, right? In order to solve problems, you have to dream up new ways of doing things. And math lovers like to dream up new ways of visualizing patterns, and they begin to visualize the hidden structures that live under everything we see. I mean, that's what your phone is doing when your GPS is doing, isn't it? New ways of visualizing patterns. And exploration cultivates in us the expectation of enchantment, right? Why do people go on voyages? Why do people visit the deep sea ocean floor? It's because we're expecting to find something surprising. So, for instance, there's this funny fish that lives at the bottom of the ocean that has a light at the end of its appendage there, right? Whoa! Would everybody just say that with me? Whoa. You wouldn't have expected to find that in advance, yes? Similarly, when this happened in the 70s, when we sent the probes to Saturn, they discovered moons that actually switch orbits every once in a while. What? Do the laws of physics allow that? Enchantment. That's what you expect at the end of an exploration. And similarly, one of my friends said to me, do you know what happens if you take a Menger sponge, which is basically a cube with a lot of cubes cut out of it, and you slice it diagonally? Do you know? Anybody here know? And I was like only half paying attention. I said, no, I have no idea. And he said, this is what happens. Whoa. What? Give me that, right? Like I'm like now taking this thing and looking at it from different angles. Like, where did those hexagonal stars come from? That's enchantment, right? This is what our math experiences should be like. To be excited by the thrill of finding the unexpected, especially things that are weird and wonderful. So this is what keeps people coming back for more, right? People who love math don't love math because they have to do 20 calculus problems, right, over and over, which can be important and useful to build skills, right? They do it because of the interesting answers to some puzzle or some interesting thing or some interesting application. Many different ways to be enchanted. And of course, here's a perfect example of that. During the pandemic, the sales of puzzles went through the roof, right? Why? Because in a time of deep distress, people are looking for escape, enchantment. And that's what puzzle thinking does for us. One of the things that Christopher and I have done recently is interact over thinking about a certain puzzle, research problem. And we just recently published a paper together with some other mathematicians on this puzzle. This is enchantment, right? This is what keeps Chris coming back for more. Here's another basic human desire, the desire for truth. This is quid est veritas? What is truth? That's Pontius Pilate's question, right? That's an important question, especially today, when misinformation abounds, right? Social media amplifies fake news. And people are often, I hear my friends saying, gosh, it's too hard to figure out what's going on in the world. Why should I even bother? Hannah Arendt, a political theorist in another turbulent time, the mid-60s, said this, and I'm going to just paraphrase rather than read this. She said, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not the lies themselves. Yes, there's a problem with lies. It's not the lies themselves, but it's the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed. When you're constantly subject to a barrage of lies, you begin to care less about what's true. Why should I even bother? It's too hard to figure out. This is a kind of era that we're living in now. But mathematical thinking should and does train us to think deeply, right? To ask deep questions. We have a thirst for deep knowledge and deep investigation. We're not satisfied with shallow answers. So when you see something in the news, you don't just say, oh, ho-hum, that's interesting, and move on. You say, wait a minute, the discovery of gravity waves? Somehow gravity bends space? How does that connect to the geometry I learned in high school? Whoa, mind blown. Causes us to dig deeper. It causes you to think for yourself, right? Not needing authority in order to figure stuff out, right? To be able to say, I know this is true because I've thought through it, not because my teacher told me or whatever political source you listen to. No, you think for yourself, right? People have motivations for spinning the news a certain way, but we learn to think for ourselves. It enables us to have humility, circumspection about what we know and what we don't know. And at the bottom of it, it enables us, mathematical thinking enables us to handle the truth accurately. Right? Isn't that what the scriptures would want us to do? Handle the truth accurately. And what's at stake? At stake is our ability to make informed decisions. At stake is our ability to be innovators, not just consumers of the technologies that change the way we live. To be able to critique the uses of math and technology. At stake is our ability to not be duped. Mathematical thinking is important. Here's another basic human desire, the desire for justice. And this is a full quote by Simone Weil. Justice is to be ever ready to admit that another person is perhaps something completely different from what we first read in him. Every being cries out silently to be read differently. This is a picture of my favorite Chinese restaurant. And if you live in a big city like Los Angeles and you go to a restaurant there, it's interesting because, different people get different menus, right? If you're in the know, if you speak Chinese, which I don't, you get a different menu. Like the first time I realized that I was like, whoa, why are they getting a different menu? And I realized every time I came with Chinese-speaking friends, we would get a different menu than when I came with non-Chinese-speaking friends. And in fact, it's kind of amazing because this is the Chinese menu has all the good stuff on it, right? It's like all the stuff I grew up eating when I was a kid, and I don't get that menu. Even now when I ask it, I'm often told, I'm rebuffed, because I speak perfect English. They don't think I speak Chinese, which I don't. They say, oh, no, you won't like the stuff on that menu. And it's caused me to reflect a bit about how mathematical spaces are like that too. We do that with people. We give people different menus, right? We say to the boys, here, take these, puzzles and toys. And we say to the girls, you can play with the dolls, right? Now, of course, there's some people who like playing with dolls and people who like playing with fire trucks or whatever it is, right? But we sort of prejudge people, don't we, right? Why do we do that? Mathematical spaces are often like the secret menu. And how do we actually begin to offer everybody an option to be able to see the good stuff on the menu? How can you welcome those who feel excluded? That might be yourself. That might be other people in your classes. It might be your kids. And thinking about this in mathematical spaces is part of what it means to do mathematics well. Being hospitable, yes, that is a mathematical virtue. Having a concern for the marginalized in mathematics is part of what it should mean to do mathematics. Willingness to being willing to challenge the status quo is a virtue. So if there's one message to this talk, it's this, that think about math as virtues, not just a set of skills. It's a multidimensional set of virtues. It's not one-dimensional, right? We're often too focused on achievement in mathematics, and it causes us often to just try to measure people by one singular thing, right? In grade school, it's like, who can solve the problems the quickest? When speed isn't even a thing when you get to my level in mathematics, right? It's not like speed isn't even important, right? Being able to think about ideas deeply turns out to be what's important. So why do we do that? There's lots of different ways to be mathematical, to be persistent, to be imaginative, to be able to interpret, to visualize, to abstract, to strategize. These are all different ways of being mathematical. And you can praise your kids or your friends for showing these different ways of being mathematical. Help people see that it's not just computation. This world doesn't need better human calculators. We have calculators for that. But it does need people who can visualize, who can abstract, who can generalize, who can be imaginative. And so you can't really separate the true practice of mathematics from what it means to be human, right? Mathematics is more than just thinking about computation. And part of what we need to do then is to believe that you and everybody in your life can flourish in mathematics. Who are you going to read differently? Now, it's several years after his first letter. Chris is doing advanced analysis and topology, right? He's helped something like 50 other inmates get his GEDs, which is his high school equivalency, right? This is a guy who never finished high school. And he says this about his education. He says, it's a sign of a skilled chess player that he or she can play well out of any position on the board. The person is unaware of his or her options is like a player who's in a bad position. Because even if there are fruitful paths available to you that you are not aware of, they may as well not exist. But by climbing our visions of ourselves, education allows us to transcend ourselves, and thereby help others to do the same. This is a vision of education for human flourishing. And so that brings me to the last human desire that I want to talk about, and that is love. You think about love as some touchy-feely thing that you do, right? But I claim that it's also important in mathematics. Because every being cries out silently to be read differently, right? Every being cries out silently to be loved, to be seen, to be known, to be encouraged in their potential. And all of us are math people because our deepest human desires reveal our mathematical nature, and we only need to awaken us. And if that's the case, then to love another human being is to see each person in your life worthy of the beauty and joy that come from understanding. Who are you going to read differently? Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Delmar Epp. I teach psychology here at CMU. I want to thank you, first of all, Francis. That was a very engaging talk, one that provokes such an expansive view of something that we thought we knew. So, whoa. In saying that, I hope that you'll forgive me when I say that the theme for this evening reminds me of a little joke, one that's been with me for many, many years. Joke is that there are two kinds of people in the world, those that can do math and those that can't do math, and those that don't even realize they can't do math. Didn't say it's a good joke. It's a silly joke. But it plays on an old idea that aptitude in math is something that we are either gifted or not, that it's a fixed quantity. Some of us have it, some of us don't have it. And we find out pretty early in life where we stand on that continuum. But it's an idea that's been with us since we first began to measure people's intellectual abilities. Probably long before that. Psychologist Carol Dweck and her colleagues have contrasted fixed versus growth mindsets. She says some of us developed a fixed mindset, an understanding that our abilities are essentially fixed, that they're not very malleable. And so we may have been blessed with certain math skills, or athletic skills, or musical skills. And if so, we can feel validated by demonstrating those skills to others. But that kind of mindset is limiting in a lot of ways. It fosters, first of all, motivation to stick to what we know, stick to goals and activities that play to our strengths. Should we fail, or possibly worse, should we find someone with more talent than we have in our area, that can be devastating. Imagine how few of us would truly aspire to big things if we believed that all of our talents were fixed and finite. And think about how we might disproportionately limit those who are subject to stereotypes, to traditionally lesser expectations, and who may come to see their own lesser performance as inevitable. But some of us instead develop a growth mindset, where our goals are not to perform to a standard, but to continue to learn and to continue to grow incrementally. These people learn that intellectual skills grow with practice and diligence and effort. And that when we fail, it's not because we don't have the capacity. Rather, we don't have it yet. I think there's real hope in the notion of yet. Failure or struggle needn't mean that we cannot, or that we should just give up. It might be tempting to interpret struggle as a signal that this achievement is beyond our grasp. But we might instead construe it as an opportunity to learn, to practice at overcoming challenge, a time to discover incrementally. I recall the many small celebrations with my daughter as she worked through her grade 10 math curriculum, and I, as her designated study partner, Dad, you must know some of this stuff. You're a professor, right? You must know some things. Not necessarily. But I relearned things I hadn't dealt with in decades. But we would look back regularly at our homework assignments from a week before, or 2 weeks before, and say, look at what we can do now that we couldn't do 2 weeks ago. It's very exciting to learn grade 10 math. One of the most encouraging things I find in Dweck's work is that this growth mindset can be taught. She and her colleagues teach school-age kids that every time they push themselves out of their comfort zone, that the neurons in their brain are making new connections and that they are actually getting smarter through this practice, which is true, by the way. They're looking specifically at math performance in these studies. She finds that over the next grading cycles, these kids' math performance actually increases. Even though the curriculum gets harder as they go, their grades increase. And by contrast, he says that those who don't receive this training tend over that same time period to see their grades decline. It seems almost too simple, but that growth mindset is arguably the single most influential factor in these kids developing these academic skills. If we can take the time to change how students understand the meaning of effort and challenge, not as something that should be discouraging or that says you don't have what it takes, but as a moment to grow. It's here that I find links to human flourishing. In a course I teach in positive psychology, we talk a lot about the concept of flourishing and about those aspects of our life that promote flourishing. And as we heard, this has less to do with positive emotionality, that sort of search for hedonic happiness. It has much more to do with finding meaning and purpose, eudaimonia and engagement, exploration and play. And we find in those explorations a sense of awe and wonder and beauty, a sense that we are part of something bigger, something enduring. I appreciated very much the discussion of why. Why should we choose to labor at developing skill or virtue through mathematics? That question is one that I have dealt with or been asked frequently. Why do we need to do math? And as I respond to my students or to my own kids, I realized my response was often lacking. My typical response to that question has always emphasized math as a way to develop a certain discipline of thought. Logical, systematic, or componential approach to solving problems. And I think that math does that, and I think that that's part of the reason why we still hold math as important. Think about the standardized testing that we do in terms of people's intellectual abilities. Standardized tests in high school, tests to get into university or grad school. But of course, as you've enlightened us, math does so much more than just teach us that manner of thinking. The meaning that we make through mathematics or through any endeavor is always meaning that involves connections to others. in our efforts to seek justice, in our efforts to show love, to encourage potential or growth, to find hope, enchantment, imagination, now and in the future. Thanks for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis and Delmar. We really appreciate the insight into what mathematics is. Beautiful insight, and the insight from a psychologist. Appreciate that. It's now your turn. We will have a microphone, this one right here, set up. And we will also give you the opportunity, if you prefer not to step up to a microphone, to send your questions in by text. And we have a group here who will be reading those texts and selecting questions occasionally. The only thing that I will ask is to please make sure that your question is a question. Context is fine if it's short, but we're not looking for lengthy dispositions from you. And we have our very first question right here. When you ask your question, please introduce yourself first.
You can't see it, but I just put the text number on the screen at the top of this slide. So maybe if you have questions, you can text them there.
Hello, my name is Raymond Rempel. I have a twofold question. I'm cheating already. First, I very much appreciate your discussion of flourishing and virtue. So first, I'm wondering though, why you return to desire so much? Because Aristotle, Plato, the Thomists would have far more talked about the good, or a more teleological approach.
Yeah.
So I'm curious why they wouldn't have thought as highly of desire.
Yeah.
Second, I'm wondering if your talk would have reached people, or would have connected with people much more 50, 60 years ago. It seems like universities and high schools have become much more instrumental in how they teach sciences and math and pretty much everything. How is your message received in a wider community which seems very hostile to this approach?
Yeah. So maybe I'll address the second question first. One of the reasons that I feel this message is important now is precisely because we've become so instrumental in what education is for and what it's about. And I'm not the only person who's sort of thinking, encouraging math teachers or mathematicians to think more broadly about the basic purposes of mathematics. There are a number of people who are thinking this direction, often motivated by a social justice angle, right? By concern for the marginalized. And I guess part of what I wanted to try to address, this talk actually came out of and the book came out of a speech that I gave to a bunch of mathematicians. And in trying to address the social justice angle, one of the things I wanted to step back from, because not everybody agrees that social justice is an important thing in mathematics. One of the things I wanted us to have everybody think about is the basic question of why we do anything we do. And so that's why I'm actually, I like to have people think about basic human desires, right? And we're not talking about, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, often, at the very base level are the things that are like basic, needs to have your physical needs met, right? I'm talking a little higher up there where, once you actually have the luxury of being able to think, as most of us are, in college are able to do, what is it that drives us to do anything we do, right? Why do you have a hobby? And if you think a little bit, because I'm speaking to a Mennonite crowd here, I can say this, that most of the basic human desires that we have are spiritual desires, right? Like a desire for truth, a desire for beauty, a desire for community, a desire for justice. And so I think virtues are important, but by themselves, what drives us to build virtue? I think often it happens because we're aiming to meet some basic human need that we have, and the virtues kind of spring from that. I don't know if that's, I don't know if that's a widely accepted view. But when I think about my own, the kinds of things that motivate me, the things that motivate me to think about math are very similar to the things that motivate me to do gardening, which is a hobby of mine, right? I have an appreciation for beauty. It's a different kind of beauty, but it's an appreciation of beauty. And I think virtue comes about by pursuing the good, the true, the beautiful in redeeming ways. There are bad ways to satisfy your desires, right? And so I think we do have a moral obligation to think about the ways that we respond to our basic desires. But they can be met in bad ways and good ways. And I'm advocating for the good. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, so I'll make another point while she goes up there. Now keep going, just stay there, yeah. And that is coming back to the social justice aspect. So I think if you're gonna get people to agree that social justice is an important consideration to think about who has access to mathematics, you have to get people to agree on what the basic purposes of mathematics are. And if those purposes are framed in terms of human flourishing, I found that that's the best way and the easiest way for people to accept that everybody deserves to have a good experience with mathematics. It seems to be a point of common ground, I think, that's easier for people to accept.
Hello, my name is Jane. I'm just wondering, when over your mathematical journey did you really realize, or what happened for you to realize that human flourishing was something that you really wanted to dig deeper and really think about in the aspect of math?
Yeah, I guess I started becoming aware of human flourishing as a frame by listening to N.T. Wright, who is a noted theologian and gave some talks at a conference that I attended in the early 2000s. And I realized that I could think about it in terms of my own discipline. And then I think someone else earlier this morning in a text question asked, although we didn't get to talk about it then, when did I start thinking about equity, diversity, inclusion as important? And I think that's, for me, been sort of growing. My own experience of that has been growing over time, right? I had this really negative experience in graduate school, which, if that kind of abuse, as it was, it's a form of abuse to tell somebody, hey, you're not really cut out for this, right? If that kind of abuse can happen to somebody like me, who's been relatively advantaged, it happens all the time to marginalized students, way earlier than it happened to me, right? We have kids in 4th grade who are basically shunted off into tracks from which they'll never recover, right? Tracks where they learn boring mathematics, they don't see anything interesting, and it doesn't lead them to viable paths to college, right? Things like that. That's a grave injustice, because people are often shunted based on background or based on race, and not based on anything that has anything to do with mathematical potential. We shouldn't be doing that to kids. Now, I haven't always been aware of that. And the longer I've been in the profession, I would say I have a pretty traditional view of mathematics, even when that abuse happened to me in grad school. And I've been coming over time to realize, we have a lot of inequity in the system, and many of these things are things that go well beyond a person's individual potential, as it were. The other thing that's happened to me is, over time, I've had many students who you might often think of as, quote, B students or C students, who've gone on to flourish, to do great things in mathematics. And you're like, wait a minute, what was I doing with that grade? Did that grade really mean what I thought it means? Grades aren't a measure of mathematical potential. Now I see that, right? They're a snapshot in time of an imperfect measure of what a student knows, right? But they shouldn't determine somebody's trajectory. I have much more experience now to see that. Hey, a grade is almost meaningless, right? 10 years from now, I like to tell a student, 10 years from now, people aren't going to care what grades you made on your transcript. but they will care what kind of person you become, what virtues you possess.
Thank you.
So, speaking of learning garbage in grade 4, here's a question from a math instructor. I'd love to teach my students to appreciate beauty in mathematics, but being able to explore, discover, and appreciate takes time, and I simply don't have time in class to do such activities because there are so many topics I need to cover.
Yeah.
I believe this is also a common problem in K-12.
Yes.
Do you have any suggestions for us?
Yeah, I have a few, and probably more ideas would happen in private conversation. But yes, there's extreme pressure to cover a certain amount of material. That's hard to push back against. One thing that I do, which doesn't take more time, instructional time, is just to include in my assessments and my homeworks reflections. Because the way you assess students is actually the biggest message they're going to get about what you value is what shows up on your exams and your homeworks. And so I often assign reflection questions, essay questions, on my assignments, both homeworks and exams. And students come to realize that these are the things that I value. And those are often opportunities for students to reflect on beauty, right? Like, so an example question might be, describe one idea in this course that you find beautiful, and explain to me why it's similar or different than other kinds of beauty that human beings encounter. I've gotten some of the most amazing responses. Not only they are amazing because they show that a student actually, is formatively, thinking about this question. But they're great for me because they often have these ideas that I hadn't noticed myself, right? Like here's what a kid said once about mathematics. They said to me, math is a lot like putting something together without instructions. I'm like, whoa, that's right. Like that IKEA furniture, right? Like, you don't want to look at the instructions, and if you're mathematically trained, you can do things for yourself. But they found a beautiful way of saying it. Now I adopt that as a way I describe mathematics. Learning math well is like knowing how to put something together without an instruction booklet. Beautiful, right? Anyway, so that's one way that a teacher can do that, is to just change the nature of your assessments. Another way, I guess part of this is incumbent among people who write curricula, is to try to develop more coherent curricula. And so there's a publication that I was involved in on the writing team for NCTM, which is the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, I think based in the U.S., that has put out a series of books called Catalyzing Change. The high school one is the one I worked on, but it basically tries to distill, like it sort of gives a guide, like if you have to cut out some standards, here are the ones that you should keep, right? And so there's a little bit of a roadmap of the most important standards to cover. And then I would say, I would favor shaving out standards and including more joy and wonder in the curriculum. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Su again.
Hi.
My name is Harry.
Hi, Harry.
I'm a first-year CMU student. So in my memory, I think there's a bunch of scientists, like modern scientists. They all have a mathematician background, such as physicists, chemists, philosophers, politicians, or computer scientists. So my question is, why math plays such a major role in our modern human civilization? And also, you mentioned cooking in your lecture. So I cook Chinese food as well. So could you just explain more? What's the relationship between cooking and solving math problems, math questions?
Yeah,
Thanks so
that's
much.
a great question. A short answer to your first question, which is why so many math-trained people are doing, these other things, is that I like to talk about mathematics. Okay, so some famous writer said that literature is equipment for living. And why do they say that? Because when you read literature, you begin to visualize yourself in other people's shoes, and you begin to to see how to think about the world, right, and how to live in the world. To borrow from that person, I would say if literature is equipment for living, mathematics is equipment for thinking. And so if you're mathematically trained, you don't have to be a mathematician in order to express learning to being able to think well. And so that's why you see a lot of people who are mathematically trained doing other things and doing them well. In terms of cooking, there's actually another mathematical writer who has a whole book about analogies between math and cooking. Her name is Eugenia Chang. And the title of the book is called How to Bake Pie, P-I. But she has a lot of, I think, really effective ways of talking about cooking. I mean, I'll just give you a few that come to mind for me immediately. Cooking. Cooking often involves getting a bunch of things together, looking at what's in your fridge and putting them together in some interesting way, right? And mathematics is often like that, right? Like you have a problem you want to solve. You don't know in advance if it's going to involve calculus or linear algebra, or discrete mathematics or statistics. You have no idea. But, you know, you have this problem and you're like, okay, what can I grab from the, from the cupboard, right? That may help me think about, oh, this thing needs a little more spice of some kind. So you go to your spice cabinet and you pull something out, right? That's often what it looks like to solve a math problem. It doesn't just come to you in textbook-like questions. Cooking involves creativity. And I've seen many mathematicians who didn't start off in college ever thinking that they would be a mathematician, but then they saw the creative side of math, right? The beautiful side of math, the way you actually have to strategize in order to figure out how to solve a problem. That's a creative process. People who say math is only about right answers are missing out, right? Like, part of the beauty of math is seeing multiple routes to solving a problem, not just getting the answer. And that's beautiful and it's creative and it's a lot like cooking in that way as well. I'll stop there, but those are some ways. But you should get Eugenia Chang's book.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Another question by text, and that is, it feels like there's some privilege and a luxury to study math in this way, either at university or intensely. How can we use math in this way to meet our basic human needs, to think about what it is to be human, if we don't have the luxury or the privilege to study in this way?
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly true about any academic discipline, that it involves privilege and luxury. And we should all be in a position where we use our privilege in order to help other people have that luxury or privilege. I would say that there are people who are thinking very deeply and carefully about how to actually use mathematics to help people solve meeting their basic needs, right? So there's a whole area now of climate change and people who are trying to solve the problem of climate change from many different angles, including mathematicians, for instance. And in fact, at Harvey Mudd this year, we're hiring somebody who's doing in the area of climate mathematics. And so, there are people who are actively thinking about questions like that. Resource allocation, solving, world hunger, right? People in operations research who are thinking about how you deliver goods more efficiently to people in various situations. So there's a lot of active mathematics around this particular question. I'm not sure if that's the direction that the questioner was asking, but yes, I mean, it is a luxury, and we should, in a privilege, and we should use our privilege well. But all of us should be able to, okay, I'll say that, but I'll also say that even if you are impoverished or poor, one of the things about mathematics that's different from other sciences is you don't need a lab, right? You can, and I didn't talk about this in tonight's talk, but in some versions of this talk, sometimes I talk about play, right? You can play with mathematical ideas. That's why, you have people from poor backgrounds like Ramanujan in India, who was able to do amazing mathematics and remained undiscovered for much of his life until a mathematician in England brought him to England, right? But you can be in impoverished situations and still experience this wonder. And I think it's part of our nature, right? Every kid, whether or not they're having their basic needs met, plays, right? And maybe they don't have all the toys that every kid might enjoy, but it's a basic desire. That's why I think about desires a lot, to play. And people find ways to play. And you can do that with math in a way that you can't do that with other disciplines. Thank you.
My name is Don Peters. This morning you spoke out of the research you've done with the American Mathematics Society. And I guess my question is, this concept that you're speaking about tonight, mathematics for human flourishing, is it your idea? Or is it something that permeates a society, an academic society like the American Mathematics Society?
Yeah.
Like, in other words, is this a movement that's come to mathematics?
Yeah.
If, as I listen here this evening, I think if I were decades and decades younger, I would be tempted to study math.
Yeah.
And decades and decades ago, I actually did, and took a degree in mathematics at the bachelor level.
Yeah, wonderful.
Wonderful. But I never saw anything about human flourishing in that.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I'm wondering is how much has this idea permeated the society?
Yeah.
And probably for the academics here who play in math, how much does it permeate the math instruction that takes place?
Yeah, great question. To my knowledge, I'm probably the first person who's put those two words together, those phrases together, mathematics, human flourishing. Although I'm not I've heard about human flourishing from N.T. Wright and theologians and philosophers for a while. And of course, as I said, there are plenty of people who think about access to mathematics and justice in mathematics. And I wanted to give it legs by having it, be grounded in something that I deeply believe and think about. And so human flourishing seemed to me the best way to talk about some of these deep desires in a way that resonates with an audience that isn't necessarily have a spiritual background. That being said, because of the speech in this book, I think people are starting to think about that language a little bit. What are the purposes of mathematics? And talk about human flourishing. The Mathematical Association of America, which I was president of, after I left office, decided to put human flourishing in its vision, right? So the vision of that society is now to envision a world in which everybody has the potential for human flourishing, something like that. And I didn't tell them to do it, so but I'm happy that they are, have that as part of their guiding vision now. But as I said, part of it comes out of just my own being steeped in reading and thinking in theology.
Thank you so much. We're at 8:30, and so we're going to move to the book signing one more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the table is right here. If you have a book, bring it with you. If not, there are stickers to sign that you can put in your future book. There is a back order, and if you'd like copies, you can speak to Arlen. Just wave your hand in the back there.